Dr. Anil Guri. I'm a consultant in reproductive medicine and assisted conception at Fertility Plus and fertility courses. So today I'm going to talk to you briefly about a subject which we think doesn't happen, but in fact it is relatively common. So in genetically screened embryos, that is pre-genetic screening of embryos, we believe there's a high success rate and the miscarriage rates are lower. And that's true to a certain extent. But as we do more and more genetic screening of embryos, we end up learning a bit more about what happens to genetically screened embryos and what is their impact on a live birth rate. So this was a paper published in RB Online, and they were looking at what factors increases the likelihood of miscarriages of a single euploid blastocyst. So can you predict and say that this may be one of the causes of why an embryo which is genetically normal may not implant? So if you have a look at this, they looked at 1,051 cases of frozen embryo transfers, which was from genetically normal embryos. And when you have a look at the results, the live birth rate was 56%. So and that's normally what we say is it ranges between anything between 55 and 65% a live birth rate with each genetically normal embryo. The miscarriage rates were 14.5%, and in 34.4%, they did not have any sign of a clinical pregnancy. So the 14.5% varies, and in some studies, the miscarriage rate is generally around 7 to 8%, and it ranges to about 15%, and it varies from different data groups. Now the question is, in which case would you be able to predict who would stand a high rate of miscarriage? And we think so. I think one is the BMI, and as BMI increases, the rate of miscarriage of a genetically normal embryo in this study increased. Second is the inner cell mass and the quality of inner cell mass. So there's a link to morphology and there's a link to genetics too. So you could have a genetically normal embryo, and that's again a nucleus-based assessment. And so you could have a genetically normal embryo which morphologically doesn't look very good, and which means the inner cell mass of the embryo is not excellent. So in those cases, if you see the inner cell mass, in those cases, you will see a slightly lower chance of pregnancy, but you also see a higher miscarriage rate. Now, the second thing which was noticed in this study, again you have to remember that what I'm presenting is a paper. So it's one paper doesn't tell you all about the evidence, but it gives you an idea about how this study is going through. And if you have a look at the miscarriage rates, now women who had previous miscarriages had a slightly higher rate of miscarrying a genetically normal embryo. So if you have a look at my previous talk, and what did we look at? That after the third or fourth miscarriage, many a time a genetically normal embryo also gets miscarried, and that is because of uterine factor more than the genetics. So what does this study to a certain extent tell us? This study to a certain extent will tell us that a genetically normal embryo does have a miscarriage rate, and that can range from 8 to 15%. In women who have had a history of miscarriage, they have a slightly higher chance of miscarrying a genetically normal embryo. Embryos that are morphologically poor, which is that the inner cell mass, the cells inside the blastocyst, are poor, in those cases, you are more likely to see a higher miscarriage rate. And as the BMI gets bigger, and as women get bigger, in this study you saw a higher miscarriage rate.